Hello and welcome to episode 20 of the Alfa RomeoDriver podcast, brought to you by the Alfa Romeo Owners Club. I'm Guy Swarbrick, and this week, to celebrate our 20th podiversary, we're going to change the format a little. Christmas and New Year are going to be a little bit different this year, and I suspect we're all going to find ourselves spending more time at home looking for something to do than we usually would. And during those few days when restrictions are relaxed, many of us will find ourselves with long, boring motorway journeys to fill. There'll be a new issue of Alfa RomeoDriver, of course. That should be with you in a week or so. And one more episode of this podcast before we take a short Christmas break. But I thought I'd put together a sort of podcast advent calendar of other things you might want to listen to. I say sort of advent calendar because, of course, we're already in December, but I'm going to give you 28 podcasts, enough to listen to a new one every day between today and the new year. The beauty of podcasts, of course, is that they're always box sets. Every time you find a new one, you have a library of old episodes to go through. So this should be enough to keep you occupied for months. I use the Podcast Addict app on my phone, which allows you to subscribe to shows and download all the episodes at once. But there are lots of ways to listen. I listen to a lot of podcasts, and not just car-related ones. QI's No Such Thing as a Fish feeds my inner geek, and the writer in me loves Helen Zaltzman's The Illusionist. My interest in car design got me interested in the designs of all sorts of things we take for granted, and there's a podcast for that too, 99% Invisible. But this is a car show, and the 28 podcasts I've selected are all car-related. Each week there'll be 2 Formula 1 podcasts, there are more of those than anything else, 2 general motorsport ones, 2 general car ones, and 1 sim racing one. If any of those topics don't interest you, there'll be plenty of episodes of shows you do like to keep you busy. The podcasts are a mix of slick, professionally produced official shows, and individuals like me in their bedrooms who have something to say, and everything in between. Some of them are conversational, some are interview-based, some are documentary-like. A friend of mine complains that all podcasts don't follow the same format, but seems quite happy that the Radio 2 Breakfast Show isn't the same as the Today programme or The Archers. The details of all the shows I've talked about will be on the Podbean page that accompanies this show, on Facebook and in the forums. So let's get on with our first week. Our first F1 podcast is the official Formula 1 show, Beyond the Grid. Many of the Formula 1 podcasts are reviews and discussions about the races themselves, but Beyond the Grid is a little bit different. It's a little longer than the average podcast, episodes are about an hour long, and it features interviews with key figures from Formula 1, including some fascinating figures from F1's history. There's a new episode every Wednesday, and in the last month Tom Clarkson has interviewed Lance Stroll, the only non-Mercedes works driver to put a car on pole this season, Lord Hesketh on James Hunt, which is a cracker, Renault Formula 1 stalwart Alan Permane, and Jochen Mass. Thoroughly recommended. Tom and Carl's The Monkey Seat is one of those bedroom podcasts that are worth a listen. Again, it's a long listen, but it doesn't seem like it as the two hosts bounce off each other on a range of subjects. It's mildly sweary and a bit shambolic, but if you want a surprisingly well-informed, gossipy, irreverent look at the world of F1, it's definitely worth a try. It's roughly weekly, but it doesn't always come out at the same time or even on the same day. The BTCC season's over, but if you want a bit of a look back on the season and some fascinating behind-the-scenes insights, the official BTCC Championship Interviews podcast is an odd mix of epic news roundups called Tin Top Tuesday, reruns of race commentaries, and short, snappy 2 to 4 minute interviews with the drivers and people behind the scenes. If you're really missing your fix of door banging, it's the most comprehensive content on the series you'll find anywhere, but it's even less critical than ITV4's coverage. For a more nuanced look at the series, there's the BTC podcast, British Touring Cars, rather than British Touring Car Championship. Presumably the name was chosen for legal reasons because the BTCC is what this is all about. Russell and Sam are clearly fans, but it's a fairly low-energy show compared to the slightly manic style of The Monkey Seat. It's 2 ordinary blokes talking about the BTCC, and the production quality isn't the best, but it's a nice contrast to the ultra-slick official show. Episodes are based around the races rather than a regular schedule, and there's a preview before each race and a review afterwards. The next podcast is the show that originally got me into podcasting, Gareth Jones on Speed. Produced by the team behind the Sniff petrol site, the Breathless Jones, his friend Zog, Richard Porter, the writer behind the best bits of the old Top Gear and the Grand Tour, and Aussie journalist Sarah Leach. It's informative, wide-ranging, funny, although often not as funny as it thinks it is. Episodes are weekly, except when they aren't, and there are some video episodes as well. Car reviews, motorsport discussions, and general car topics. Sometimes it'll have you screaming at your phone, but you'll be back next week for more. The penultimate podcast for week 1 is something completely different. and definitely one for the industry followers rather than the petrol heads. It's produced by US industry publication Automotive News. It's very American and a little dry and not particularly entertaining, but some of the subjects they cover are interesting. The format is to cover long stories over multiple bite-sized episodes, all published together. And recently they've covered topics ranging from the leading women in the US automotive industry through to the industry's response to the coronavirus pandemic and life in automotive retail over the last 6 months or so. Not everything has to be fun, and this is the sort of thing that industry car geeks like John Griffiths and I, well, maybe just John and I. Finally, for week one, it's one for my fellow sim racers. There aren't that many esports or virtual racing podcasts, as most of the vast amount of gaming content is aimed at the YouTube generation. But there are quite a few of us oldies reliving the youth we never got to have on virtual racetracks, and the most obvious place to start is the Sim Racing Paddock podcast. Tens of thousands of new podcasts were launched during the lockdown on both sides of the pond, and this is one of them. There are only 5 episodes so far, and it does look as though it might have stalled a couple of months ago. But the episodes that are there are worth a listen. Covering the tech in the next generation of consoles, virtual reality, and an interview with Ross Bentley, a racing instructor who wrote a series of books called Speed Secrets that should be interesting to real racing drivers as much as virtual ones. And as a bonus for today, for real and sim racers alike, Bentley has a podcast too, also called Speed Secrets. So it's week 2 and we're back to F1. Missed Apex is probably my favourite F1 podcast, despite the irritating ads you have to endure for the first couple of minutes, but these things aren't free to produce. Hosts Matt Trumpets and Richard Spanners Reddy, I know, it's a podcast thing, are regularly joined by respected F1 journalist Joe Soward. Their slogan is, "We're not always right, but we're first." And it's a brilliant mix of race reviews, previews and interviews that draw on a vast network of F1 contacts. Regular guests include the editor of Race Car Engineering and ex-F1 team boss Matthew Carter. If you only listen to one F1 podcast, this is the one you should listen to. Again, it's on the longer side. Their race reviews push 2 hours, but the time flies by. Thoroughly recommended. Our amateur F1 podcast this week is one of the few automotive podcasts with an Italian angle, the Ferrari-focused Tifosi Talk. Carlo hosts a team of US Latino Ferrari F1 fans who review every race from a Ferrari perspective. If I'm honest, it's slightly shambolic and the audio quality isn't brilliant. It's a bit like listening to a conversation in a pub. But they're all obsessed with Ferrari and their amateur enthusiasm can be quite engaging. They don't know who all the drivers are or which end the engines are at. A lot of each episode consists of them asking each other questions they can't answer, but they do love those red cars. Half an hour to an hour per episode, it's a little bit different, and if nothing else, it highlights that this podcast thing isn't quite as easy as some podcasters make it sound. Motorsport Magazine's podcast is a series of roughly weekly, hour-long themed interviews. The most recent 2 themes were F1 engineers, with Andy Cowell, Rob Smedley, Patrick Head, Frank Durney, John Barnard and Gordon Murray, and Ferrari drivers, with Gerhard Berger, Ivan Capelli, Stefan Johansson, Derek Bell and Felipe Massa. It's a great choice for long journeys and a pleasant change from race reviews. Motorsport.com's offering, by contrast, focuses on news and issues in the sport from around the world. Produced in Australia but using Motorsport.com's network of experts from around the globe. Recent topics have included the FIA's response to Lewis Hamilton's practice starts in Formula 1, Aussie saloon car racing at Bathurst, Toyota at Le Mans and Takuma Sato's Indy 500 career. Short 30-minute episodes means it's a nice, easy listen. Another one that seems to have stalled a bit is the Drive Tribe podcast. From the team behind the not very successful social media site of the same name, and of course behind Amazon's The Grand Tour, you know which 3 I'm talking about, which is supposed to be a weekly podcast but seems to have stopped a couple of months ago. Despite that, the 46 episodes that are in the archive are worth a listen. The most recent episode is an entertaining interview with James May, but the normal format is a car review and a news roundup. But there are occasional gems like the Morris Hamilton feature on Niki Lauda. Car journalists Dan Prosser and Andrew Frankel have a weekly podcast linked to their Drive Nation YouTube channel. The most recent hour-long episode presents their list of the greatest cars of all time, and recent topics have included the implications of the forthcoming petrol and diesel cars ban in the UK, the best suspension systems, and their guilty pleasures, the cars they like but shouldn't. Another definite recommendation. Our last choice for week 2 is our sim racing podcast. This one's produced by racedepartment.com, which is the best source of sim racing news, discussions, add-ons, apps, mods and tracks. The podcast investigates the big issues of the day in and around sim racing. Is Lewis Hamilton really the greatest of all time? Are there too many GT3 cars in sim racing? Should sim racers have to pay for the right to stream games they've bought? And the next generation of graphics cards. Episodes range from 1 to 2 hours, depending on the subject, and are published when they're ready to publish. The most recent episode was 2 days ago, the one before that 3 weeks ago, and the previous one the day before that. That's podcasting. Back to F1 as we move into week 3, and our pro podcast is the excellent F1 Nation, with Channel 4 commentator Alex Jacks and his Radio 5 counterpart Tom Clarkson. It's another F1 magazine show rather than race previews and reports, and all the better for that. The latest episode is an interview with Dr. Ian Roberts and Alan van der Merwe about the Romain Grosjean crash in Bahrain, and recent episodes have covered Lewis Hamilton's early career, Christian Horner on Alex Albon, and the best-looking Formula One car of all time. Another one I definitely recommend. This week's amateur, or perhaps it would be fairer to say enthusiast, F1 podcast is the Three Legs, Four Wheels Formula One podcast from the Isle of Man. Another roundtable format production featuring Chris, Dan, Lee, Paul and Sean. The production values are good and it's an interesting mix of news and opinion rather than race reports. Again, slightly sweary in places, but nothing too offensive. Roughly every 2 weeks, it varies in time from 1 to 2 hours, but definitely worth a listen. Our next motorsport podcast is one of my favourites, and an essential listen for anyone interested in historic racing, the Marcus Pye podcast. Sadly, it's another one that stalled quite quickly after only 14 episodes. Classic Alfa fans will particularly enjoy episode 13, where Marcus interviews Julius Thurgood of the Historic Racing Drivers Club, an organiser of the Classic Alfa Challenge. Episodes vary in length from 45 minutes to an hour, so it's another nice one to listen to over a lunch break or in the car. Midweek Motorsport is produced by the people behind Le Mans Radio and covers all forms of four-wheeled and two-wheeled motorsport. As the name suggests, it comes out every Wednesday evening with 2 to 2.5 hours of news, features and, at this time of year, season reviews from various championships. There are almost 600 episodes in the archive, which should keep you going well into the new year. If there's an automotive TV presenter equivalent of Marmite, it's probably fifth gear presenter Johnny Smith. I can take him or leave him on TV, but I do enjoy Smith and Sniff, his conversational podcast with Sniff Petrol's Richard Porter, who appeared earlier on Gareth Smith on Speed. It's an irreverent look at cars and, well, other stuff. Recent subjects include car clubs, interviewing for Top Gear, and chin spoilers. It's slickly produced, but doesn't take itself too seriously, and is another recommended listen. From the old Top Gear's writing team to the current presenters, or specifically the one who knows about cars, well, if you've seen his Top Gear conversation with me talking about my 939 Spider, let's say he knows something about some cars. Anyway, the Collecting Cars podcast with Chris Harris is a series of interviews with celebrity petrolheads about the cars they own. Recent guests include Jenson Button, Derek Bell, Damon Hill and Gordon Murray. Another one I'd thoroughly recommend. Our only really commercial podcast is EA's Motorsport Games podcast with Martin Lee. Interviews with sim racers and YouTubers and coverage of professional esports events from NASCAR to Le Mans. Despite the corporate branding, it's another relaxed conversational show and a very easy listen. And it might give you a few more ideas about what to spend all those Amazon vouchers on. When did Amazon vouchers become the new socks? Into our final week, it's the 28th of December and the New Year's on the horizon. But somehow this week always seems to last forever. Never fear, we have lots for you to listen to. No F1 podcast roundup would be complete without Autosport's F1 show. This is a bit of a cheat because Autosport claims it's a general motorsport show, and they have had an esports feature and an interview with rally legend Michel Mouton in the last month, along with 16 F1 stories. As you'd expect if you read the magazine, this one is very much race-oriented, with previews and reports on free practice, qualifying and the races. Episodes tend to be shorter, 15 to 45 minutes, but well-informed and well-produced. Our last F1 podcast is Beyond the Racing Line, another Aussie podcast hosted by Roger Byron. The British media can be a little jingoistic at times, so it's nice to listen to someone who knows without doubt that Daniel Ricciardo is in fact the greatest of all time. That's a little bit unfair. These 90-minute post-race features are well produced, and it's always interesting to get another perspective on the F1 scene. And there are 100 episodes available if you want to get a little nostalgic. I didn't pick Sean Smith's Stelvio Automotive entirely because of the name. Mostly, but not entirely. Although Sean does cover non-motorsport subjects, his This Month in Motorsport is worth a listen. It's another Three Blokes in a Pub format, but it focuses on the world outside Formula One, which makes a refreshing change. Again, it doesn't seem to have a regular publication date, but the 40 to 50 minute episodes are a good way to catch up on what's happening in sports cars and the feeder single-seater formulae. It's a brand new year now and you've probably got a hangover. You've almost certainly been up too late and are having a lazy morning. Well, here's something to wake you up. The Manhattan Car Club's Sonic Drives is unlike any other podcast in that it focuses on the driving experience and the soundtrack that accompanies that drive. Despite the US origins, the presenter's English and presents each episode as though he's just finished reading the Wikipedia page and is desperate to share all the facts he's found. The main reason for including it is the episode on the Alfa Romeo GTV 2000. Alfa content is a rare thing in the podcast world, and after 5 minutes of preamble, the podcast finally lives up to its name and we're treated to that familiar raspy engine note. Sam Moore's Car Chat podcast is another interview-based show and features a broad range of petrolhead personalities. Recent guests include Andrew Frankel of Drive Nation, Maximilian Cooper, one of the people behind the Gumball series, Darren Turner of Aston Martin, and Christian von Koenigsegg of Koenigsegg. A nice podcast to dip into. Motorsport Stories is a slightly unusual podcast. A bite-sized series of roughly 10-minute long stories covering subjects from motorsport technology and road cars to the history of NASCAR, the Dakar Rally, and the life of Jochen Rindt. It's particularly unusual in that it has a female presenter, Victoria, a history student from Ireland. Our final show is another one for the sim racers, and for real racing drivers too. It's called Motorsport Coaching, and it's a series of features on the necessary evils of progressing a career in motorsport. PR, social media, coaching, there's another Ross Bentley interview, and branding. Not for everyone, but if your New Year's resolution was to finally get into a racing car, or to turn sim racing into a more than a casual hobby, it's a good place to start. That's all we've got time for this week, but we've really only scratched the surface. There are plenty of other podcasts that are worth a listen, and I've included details of the 28 I've covered here and a dozen or so more on the podcast webpage. We're back to our normal interview format in a couple of weeks' time with episode 21, the last episode of 2020, available from Podbean, iTunes, YouTube and wherever good podcasts are found from 1:30 on Sunday the 20th of December. Until then, stay safe.